getting back to evangelism. Um, so I think we all could agree that, I mean, tell me if this is an accurate articulation of sort of the point you're getting at, which is yes, the New Testament does have various forms of evangelism. Some of those are proclamation, some of those are apologetic, but it does seem to be that the most common theme when it comes to evangelism was not those revival moments. It was the ongoing living in community that took place among the people. Is that a fair or would you even say maybe not even that?
I don't even know if I go that far. I feel like I would be really I don't feel like I can make a strong enough argument with like the extra biblical stuff to even say that. What I'm simply suggesting is that by approaching the problem with that understanding, you're not even going to get the right solution because you're asking the wrong question. That's the argument I
Hmm.
think I'm trying to articulate. And the second thing is that part of what was so good about the early Christians is they created a culture by what they did and what they said. So like
Hmm.
apologetics carried weight because they knew when to use them. They're very pragmatic.
Hmm.
I feel like, and I don't know this, and this is probably some eisegetics. So some scholars listening to this and dying a little bit on the inside. I hope Dr. Ellis listens to this. Actually, I'd really love
Hmm.
I'd love his take. Actually, I really have a lot of respect for him. Anyway, so like, my argument. Gosh, I lost my train of thought. Giving Dr. Ellis compliments. It's a vice, let me tell you. You just gotta give a shout out to your New Testament professor. But I just don't know if I can make that argument. I'm just saying like they tend to be. It seems to me that they tend to be very pragmatic in their approach. So like
Hmm.
wherever they're at, like, Paul runs into a temple. He's like, hey, you guys like all these gods? They're pretty great. I know the unknown one that you got to think. They're like, oh, really? Who is he? Tell us about him. He's like, yeah, his name's Jesus, and he's actually the only one. And you know what I mean? Like, it's like that's not like an apologetic and a traditional like a merit like that what we're debating right now, right? It's not like a
Hmm.
here's why monotheism is correct and this is the argument for I actually really appreciate apologetics, modern apologetics. Like, I think I find some of the arguments really compelling. I find some of the scholarship actually pretty well done. Shout out to William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga or Plantinga. I don't know how you actually say it, but Al, you're great. But like, that wasn't their approach. Like, I think what the problem is that we like isolate and we don't. This sounds bad. We don't really employ the right method at the right time. Does that make sense? Or we just double
Yeah.
down on like, or even like what my initial critique was, we just asked the wrong question. We just try to force this moment on there, And I
Hmm.
don't want to be critical of John Wesley. That's a tradition I grew up in, but like, I really feel like that romantic movement within the church, like responding to that like rigidness and like secularism of modernism, like kind of had a little bit of backlash that we still deal with, especially
Hmm.
within Christian theology, because like we're always pushing for that like transformation Aldersgate experience. But like
Yeah.
not everybody comes to faith through Aldersgate. You know what I mean? Like I one of my really good friends who's like one of the most like godly, like this I'll just say his name because I know he's been on the pod. It's Rick. It's Rick. Like Rick's faith is very like it's not like that at all. Like I've
Hmm.
prayed with Rick. Rick's prayed for me. I've worshipped with Rick for like long period of time, and it's very like when we went to revival services together, he would be like, that's a good sermon, like no response at the altar at all of it. Like no, it's just like all the emotional moment, like he hits his homer one time. I like, so if you have a Nazarene background, you'll appreciate this. I interned with Jeremiah Bullock for a summer, and I got access to like every sermon he ever did. And they're all public anyway, but like at the time they weren't. And so like I got access to all these stuff, and I was like showing it to somebody. So Rick's like telling me like one time in the car when we're preaching Ambassador Trip, it's him and I. How Jake Gregory let this happen, I do not know, but he did. So it's just him and I. And he's like, well, I really want you to listen to this Dallas Willard sermon because I think it's really good about the faith. And I was like, okay, whatever. So we listened to like the whole thing, and I was bored out of my mind. That's not a knock on Dallas Willard. I just haven't listened to him since then. But I was really riding the struggle bus, and I was like, okay, I was fine. It was good. Had some good things to say. I was like, but let me show you this. So I played like a Jeremiah Bullock sermons, and it's like one of the heavy hitters. It's like because like he has like a handful of sermons he does for revivals, and I've been to like
Hmm.
a ton of his revivals, and I know which ones they are, and like I know which the one. Like he's just such a great communicator. Like he just knows how to hit home. So I play the like one of the three that like really like knock it out of the park, like the crowd pleaser, so to speak, the greatest hits. And Rick goes,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess he said some good stuff, and we just keep driving. It was so casual, but like, and I use Rick as an illustration because like Rick is like a really really bright person, and his faith is so genuine and so real, but it doesn't look like the transformation stuff. There's is none of that. Like that's like it's not that it's foreign or abhorrent to him. It's just like it just, you know what I mean? It's like it just is there. It's just like, I guess there's another way to go about it. I guess I'm fine the way I am, move on with my day. And I think that we need to, I think we overemphasize stuff and we lose sight of that. And I think that actually it pushes out people who don't,
Hmm.
who tend to not have like deep emotional lives. It's not like arguing for sociopaths in the church or anything. My point is like, that highly rational friend you have that like never gets worked up, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Always even keel, and they always really approach problems like I think you push people like that out, and I think that's a real thing. And I think those people are actually sometimes some of the best communicators. Are you laughing at me? You're laughing at Rick?
No, I'm laughing because that's me, dude.
Yeah, that is
And
actually
I'm
you.
laughing because I'm like, I've been in a lot of those services and I've hated it because I'm a pastor and I have to be there and I just want to get up and leave.
Like, it was fine.
I'm like, I don't want to be here.
I don't even want to be here. I don't want to be here anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to be a bit more fiery, so like I don't have that. I don't have that gene in me. I'm not even keel all the time. Spoilers. But that is what it
Yeah.
is. You can only be you. So I don't know. Like, does that make sense what I'm arguing though? Like, I just think like,
Yeah, it does. So
all right,
I guess I'll amend my original statement,
okay, all right.
which is that,
It's like we're passing a bill or something.
yeah, maybe proclamation and apologetics do have their place in evangelism, but they should not be our only mode of evangelism. And maybe they shouldn't even be our just go-to mode of evangelism
That's
in American Christianity.
probably true. Mm,
And
mm,
they
mm.
certainly shouldn't be just encapsulate all of what evangelism is. Because what I'm seeing, and I'll actually get into the Old Testament uh, here just in a second, but what I'm seeing is a lot of movement towards a community building form of evangelism, with people wanting to be like, you know what, we need to actually be the church, right? And what they mean by that is we need to be out in the community, doing different things like building relationships with people, not on the front end saying, hey, come to Jesus, then you can be a part of what we're doing, but going out and sort of being a part of the process with other people, kind of inviting them into what the church is doing without necessarily having to be a part of the church. And you know, essentially building community, which I do see a lot of movement towards that direction, which I think appeals a lot towards our generation. And I would even say Gen X, although at the time, I think Gen X sort of suffered under the fact that they grew up under a very revival focused generation. So maybe they didn't have a way of articulating very well what an alternative form of Christian living and uh, conversion actually look like. I don't know. But
Yeah, no,
would
no
you
offense,
say
but Gen
at
X is
least that
just
that's a
weird.
fair, yeah, but would you say that that's a fair articulation of, at the very least, what a lot of churches are actually looking at doing and like how they're approaching the question of what does evangelism look like?
Yeah, I think that's like the balance out, because like realistically what we've done, like, this is just how things work, right? You present an
Yeah.
idea and someone like really hates it and they just do the exact opposite, and they're like, I'm
Mhm.
being perfectly rational. It's like, no, you're just sticking it to them. But like, that's like okay, so can I rant? Is this a safe place to rant?
Sure.
All right, I guess Ben's like, dang it.
Yeah.
Ben's like, I
I'm
hate.
like, well, I'm sure people are like, let's just get to the Old Testament. Like you're teasing
All
us.
right, all right.
It's been like 35
All right, I'll
minutes.
go quickly. I'll go quickly. All right, but this is the cult model that I talked about, man. Like, this is the
Yeah.
cult model that I get so annoyed with. Like like incorporate into the community, make you an essential part of their lives, and be like, oh hey, but also we believe all these things. You know what I mean? Like, welcome to the group. Like, I don't know. You want to like drink Kool Aid? I don't. I think that sounds stupid, but like, it's true. And I'm just really hesitant to like do that because I think there's like a little
Mhm.
give and take there. And I also think it's really bad to systemically like evangelize non-Christians in general, to like do it in like a systematic way. Um, Here's a really interesting, powerful, and very difficult thought. I think that if Christians were more open and honest with their own faith, they would be forced to have non-Christian friends, which is a really bold statement. Um, and that sounds really pretentious and like really mean, but I think the problem is that Christians struggle to communicate with non-Christians and be relevant in their evangelism, whether it's bringing them into a community or even being like apologists, is because a lot of Christians tend to insulate themselves in the community because we bring them in and we make them join the community first, and the community becomes the totality of their, their Christian know-how, and their friends are all Christians, and their small group is their best friends, and all their kids eat together and go to youth group, and then they grow up and they'll go to Olivet Nazarene University, or insert Christian college here. And I don't mean it to be mean, or hurtful, but they do, or they whatever. And then eventually, like after all that goes by, like you're like 40 years has passed, and it's like, oh yeah, I haven't seen Tommy, who I used to get with, every Tuesday, that hasn't gone to church in 6 years. And you're like, Tommy, what's going on? They're like, oh, been divorced 6 times. My life's miserable. And like, you had no idea any of this was going on, even though you were good friends. And that's a really, really mean analogy and illustration, but I think it's not all that far from true. Uh, and I think that because you don't know what the conversations are and the appearances are of the people that aren't in your own like Christian bubble. I'm not talking about Facebook posts. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like actual real conversations, like hanging out, going to dinner, doing all the real stuff. Uh, that's the kind of stuff that I think churches lack a little bit, and I think it makes it really hard to employ an apologetic, because I think that your argument, like that incorporation model of bring them into the community and then tell them later, like it just kind of breeds that culture, because like you kind of, I don't want to say you isolate them, but you kind of like incentivize them to join the community first, to the point where it's like you don't teach them that you should go out into the community because they had to come to your community. You know what I mean? Become part of it first. Do you understand what I'm saying, Ben? Am I
I think so, and I think I would also disagree,
okay? All right.
because, I mean, it is part of the Great Commission to go and make disciples, so there is that
That's true.
sort of expectation, like, yes, we do need to be inviting people to be a part of it, and that does need to be,
Yeah, it has to happen.
on our radar as a goal. And the part of that does need, there is a process involved there. Obviously, overly turning it into a system, I think, is messed up. But I think we just tend to do that anyways. It's just how humans are. We like to make things mechanical because we can predict results, so we like to follow those trends. It is what it is.
And I'm like
But
that. I prefer that, but I think there's some critiques that we have to acknowledge.
sure, yeah, and I think there's some critiques too. But I also know a lot of people are asking, what should evangelism look like, especially when revival models aren't working, and
Yeah.
that's where I come around to. If you really want to look for a good model, I think we need to look at the Old Testament, and so here we are, 45
All
minutes
right.
later.
Hey, I mean, it's a good
It's
discussion, I
okay.
guess.
So, yeah, and you might disagree with this. It sounds like you might, given what you said, and that's totally fine. We can talk about that or whatever.
Sure.
But in the Old
Kind of the whole point
Testament,
of the podcast.
well, I guess I'll take a step back and just explain evangelism just very broadly. Evangelism, because I'm sure some people are like, well, evangelism didn't exist in the Old Testament because evangelism started with Jesus. A lot of maybe Reformed people might say Paul. I know Scott McKnight sort of makes that case in his book, uh, the the King Jesus Gospel. Uh, the case for the Reformed view being evangelism and the gospel really started with Paul, but that's an aside. Because the gospel, yes, it is about Jesus as Lord, but of course, the larger picture is, yes, the world is broken, but God's doing something about it, and He wants you to be a part of the process. I mean, that's really the broader picture of what the gospel is. And that being said, then that also was present in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament was all about the people of God being used by God to bring about His uh, redemption process. Obviously, it looked different because Jesus wasn't alive yet, so like the ultimate fulfillment of that plan hadn't come to fruition, but it was still a part of the process. And that's why, a lot of stuff in the Old Testament happened the way that it did. The Old Testament is not just a backdrop for the New Testament. The Old Testament actually articulates what the gospel is and what it should look like. That's why he talks about justice a lot. That's why he has the laws, and the laws, as boring as they might sound, are actually really good examples of how people should treat one another, because like in ways that are respectful and that preserve the dignity of humanity, stuff like that, that actually bring about restoration and healing. But the way that the in the Old Testament the people evangelized, so to speak, was really a process of belonging before they believed. And it just sort of
Mhm.
happened. It wasn't I wouldn't even say it was intentional. That's just how it happened. So, I mean, right from the beginning, like the story of the Old Testament, the story of Israel isn't about Israelites. Like, because when you look at it, they're really not a homogenous group. Like, right from the beginning, you have the calling of Abram, but Abram, as a part of his journey, acquired a lot of Egyptian servants, and they became a part of the Hebrew people also. So it's not like it was this pure genetic line. There was sort of outsiders and foreigners that were always a part of it. Then you have uh, Moses. Moses marries a Midianite who's somewhat related to the Hebrew people, but still distant enough that it's like they're foreigners too. Like Zipporah was the daughter of a Midianite priest. So it's like there's something weird going on there. When the Israelites or the Hebrews come out of Egypt, there's also Egyptians that join them. And then along the way, going into the promised land, they acquire more foreign people, like, specifically Rahab, who was not an Israelite. She was a Canaanite. Later on in the story of Judges, you have Ruth, who was a Moabitess, and Ruth is actually the only person that I'm aware of in the Old Testament that actually has what we would call a conversion experience. Like, and even then, it's sort of like, what does that look like? Because her articulation is, "Oh, your people will be my people, your God will be my God." Like, that's the closest we get to an actual conversion in the Old Testament, is how we understand it. But throughout that whole time, like they're still the people of God, and they're still, yeah, they mess up a lot, but God still uses that entire community to like accomplish his will. And I think that should play into how we approach evangelism, where it's not like we got to get all these people saved and that's step 1. It should be, hey, we need to recognize that God is using us to bring about his plan for redemption, and that involves not just us, but it involves all the people around us too, and so we should work together with them in that process. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance there. I could get into more details of like, okay, what does that look like from a theological or like religious perspective, and all of that. But that's why I think the Old Testament articulates that really well. I also feel like that's very much present in the New Testament, but the New Testament doesn't articulate that very well, at least for Western readers. So that's why I'm like, I think we need to look at the Old Testament as a model for evangelism, and consider that a little more closely for what maybe the church should, you know, be promoting as a methodology. I know that that sounds really systemic, but or systematic, but
No, no, no. But
anyways,
you're not wrong though. But like the approach is, I guess, fairly organic. So basically, like in summary, let me make sure I got the whole thing. And also, it gives you a chance to nuance anything I butcher, because I'm gonna butcher it, I'm sure. You become part of the
okay,
community first because they invite you in, right?
yeah,
It, I don't know. Is it like because I just don't know what that invitation. I'm just trying to understand.
yeah. I mean, it's well, there, yeah. So there are some differences. Like Rahab isn't really invited in. Like she kind of wants to be a part of the community. She's like, "Hey, like I see what's going on here. Like I recognize that you guys are like a powerful group." And the thing is, a lot of these instances where people join the Israelites, sometimes like they don't even care about the fact that like they don't really care about Yahweh very much. Like sometimes they do it out of fear, sometimes they do it because they're like hedging their bets a little bit. Sometimes they're like, "Hey, we can be prosperous too, so we'll join you guys." So the motivations is always very different in that case, and some people are
Mm.
invited, some people just sort of end up there. But the funny thing is like the whole point seems to be just like, "Hey, join our community." Even if it doesn't even seem like a healthy motivation at first, like, just joining the community is a part of like what's going on here. So, which I know is maybe uncomfortable because even that carries a lot of nuance. But I think it goes along with like what you said. Like as a Christian, you need to have non-Christian friends. But doesn't that also serve the function of like the redemptive process? Even if those people never convert, does that not serve a purpose in the overall thing? So even so, that's why I sort of hate the fact that I have to report numbers as a pastor, because it sort of puts emphasis on like you need to have people who like officially come under the umbrella. Otherwise, by our metrics, you're not really doing the work of the church. And it's like, but doesn't
Yeah, it's
that
like, oh hey,
connection serve that ultimate purpose though?
Yeah, we don't need to get into the church's business model because that's another podcast for another day. But no, your illustration is really good.
Yeah.
So okay, all right. So there's a lot to unpack there, and it's really good. So I have some other questions. So like the outside does I guess I just don't really know because I always feel like these stories kind of like drop off a little bit. Maybe with the Egyptian servants, they're not like a primary deal. Also, your Old Testament knowledge is like 10 times mine. Do like Rahab and Ruth like well Rahab does. Is it Ruth or Rahab that says your people be my people? It's Rahab.
Uh, Ruth.
Dang it, I always get them back
Yeah,
mixed up.
Rahab was it's okay. Rahab was the prostitute at Jericho.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
So
for our listeners.
yeah, no, you're good. Obviously for me too, because I don't know what I'm talking about. Um,
Oh.
that was a joke. It was a bad joke. But my question is like outside of Ruth, who's the only conversion experience, like are these people actually like quote unquote like not ethnically Jewish, but like Jewish? Like are they like, you know, participating in Passover? Are they doing the things? Or are they just following around, like hanging on to the frills of like, hey, this is the hot ticket item? And I don't mean that to be mean, but like what, like I just don't know. Like, and so like, because here's my question, Ben, and this is not like I get your point is fair and it's valid and it presents a really compelling, interesting model. But like
Hmm,
ultimately, we're not talking strictly about joining a community. Community is an integral part of faith, but being part of the faith community is indicative of your soteriological status to some degree, right? And I mean
sure.
that by like your status in terms of am I a Christian or am I not a Christian? Like your identity
Hmm,
as a person. And I like hanging out with a bunch of Christians doesn't mean that you're a Christian. You know what I mean? That's such like a stereotypical like evangelical nuance, but I think it exists because there's some validity to it, even if it's not really well articulated. Like the validity is like, okay, you don't. I'm not going to say that you have to have like the transformation Ruth moment, but like what extent can you be part of a community that you don't even believe or even know what you believe? That is my question. You know what I mean?
yeah. Well,
Moreover, like we're also trying to bring them not only into the community but into
mhm,
what we would argue would be like a relationship or the power, the
mhm.
presence of the Holy Spirit to some extent. I That's going to get really nuanced too, but I don't know. Maybe I'm asking the wrong question.
Well, here's the interesting thing. Um, if a claim of adherence to a specific set of beliefs, or like what
Dang
you
it!
mentioned, a soteriological position,
Yeah, you saw.
is like the metric for
Just walked right into it.
I just what?
I just walked right into it. Well played.
That's okay.
This is a chess match. You just checked me.
Is like the metric that we use to determine if someone's a part of the community or not.
Dang
I
it.
might say no, because if that's the case, then we have to eliminate the disciples
The thing is,
themselves.
I
And
know
I
we've
guess
talked
that's
about this, and you know
we have.
I agree.
I'm really
Yeah, I
sorry. I
know.
feel like I burst your bubble. It wasn't even
Checkmate.
intentional. But for the sake of our
No, it's
for
okay.
the sake of our listeners or our watchers, this will be really interesting, I think. The
Crying
disciples
over here.
themselves, yeah, I find it interesting. Alan Hirsch actually does a really good job breaking this down, and he could do it much better than I
Mm,
could. The disciples, according to like present day American Christianity, were not believers. Like they were not Christians. I know a lot of times we tend to assume that they are because they're there with Jesus doing stuff with Jesus, but they clearly do not know who Jesus is. Like every time Jesus does a miracle or something, like they're the ones that don't get it. Like when he's walking on water, they're like, "Who is this?" Like they thought he was a ghost. When he calms the sea, they're like, "Who is this guy? Like what on earth is he doing?" Even when Peter declares that he's the Christ, then Jesus goes on to say, "Okay, well I'm going to have to suffer and go die." And then Peter like rebukes him again because they really just don't get it. They don't know who Jesus is. They don't know like everything that he stands for clearly. They don't understand his teaching. If you read the Gospel of Mark, it's actually pretty comical. In every single instance where Jesus does something or when he teaches, it seems like the only people that don't get it are the disciples. Like everybody else does. Like even the centurion who's at the foot of the cross who like crucified Jesus, even he gets it at the end. And the disciples are still clueless. Like even at the resurrection, they're still pretty confused. And at the beginning of the Great Commission passage at the end of Matthew, it's pretty fascinating. It says that the disciples were all gathered there, but then there's this note that says, but some doubted. Like, so even there, after Jesus was resurrected, even some of the disciples were like, I don't really think this is a thing. Like, I don't know if I buy into this. Um, but yet those were disciples. And I also think it's pretty telling that Jesus in the Great Commission said, go and make disciples. He didn't say go and make converts. He just said go and make disciples. And so I think that should play into what evangelism looks like, because we like to make it all about making converts. Maybe we should make evangelism about making disciples. And that really lowers, I would almost say maybe even eliminates a little bit the bar of entry, because being a disciple just, again, it goes back to the Old Testament. You could even call those people disciples. Why? Because they were a part of the community and they were still fulfilling, even if they weren't really aware of what was going on, even if they didn't understand all the religious messages, and even if they didn't understand the Torah, they were still a part of that process, um, even if it was just by proxy. And so I don't know, maybe the issue, I feel like I'm bringing up a lot of points here at the end. Maybe the real issue
No, you're
is that
not.
we tend to own the moment of believing, and we tend to own the process of convicting and saving, when really we should just be owning the process of uh, introducing people to Christ and what that looks like, rather than saying, like, owning the salvation process, right? Because it's the Spirit that convicts and saves. That's not our job. But for some reason, we tend to own that part, which I think is, maybe that's what I'm really criticizing here, is the idea that evangelism is about convicting and getting people saved, when it should just be about fostering a community of discipleship, which is much more broad and much
Mhm.
more inviting. And it allows room for non Christians, even. Like, non Christians can be disciples. It doesn't mean that they're saved, but that's not our job. I don't know.
Yeah, it's
I
true.
feel like I just threw a
That's
lot
a
out there. I
really
don't know. What are your thoughts?
no, you just made a really good argument. Now I'm really salty about it, is what you did. Uh, yeah, you
I'm
can choke on that
sorry.
water. Just kidding. Can you tell I'm
My bad.
competitive? No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I am competitive, but I'm kidding. Actually, it was really well said. So I guess the only thing that I struggle with, and this is something I'm just going to have to figure out, and I just haven't thought enough about it. And you just made such a really good case, is that like I just am really hard. It's really hard for me to want to give up the idea of truth as proposition,
Mm,
which is really what we're discussing at this point. Like for me, I want to say, well, at some point you have to acknowledge, like, to be a Christian, that like Jesus is the Christ. Like it's really hard to be a Christian without saying Jesus is the Christ. Having said that, the irony is that my own theology is kind of doubling back on me, and I think maybe I've just been too stubborn on something. So I think you actually might be right, Ben, and I might not have a counterpoint for you. But like I tend to be like when I approach like a soteriology. So this is getting really theological, but I tend to be an inclusivist rather than a particularist, if you remember those terms
mm,
from our Theo class. For the listeners who don't know, an inclusivist is someone that has a broader spectrum of what it means to be a Christian versus a particularist that requires something a little more specific. And what I argued was a case for particularism, which is like truth is proposition, affirm these things, versus the
mm.
the inclusivist one, which Ben argued, which is what I actually subscribe to, and I just backed myself into a corner. So you saw it here first, folks. You'll probably see it again sometime if we do another one of these. But I don't know. I can't deny that. I'm still not absolutely sold on the idea of part of the community, um, and I have some reservations because of how I understand the Old Testament, which maybe will be worth to hash out, maybe not. And secondly, because I think that also is appropriate for their cultural milieu, and I'm not sure that's appropriate for our cultural milieu, because you have to
Mm.
keep. And I told you this in prep. We always have to keep in mind as Christians, like the context that we live in, if we're trying to be part of our own, like our own culture, our own community, our own world in a broader sense, right? Like Christianity was like the biggest religion in the world. More so, it was one of the like most powerful religions. It probably still is, but definitely during the Dark Ages, they're called the Dark Ages for a reason. It's because the church was really corrupt and we were doing some pretty crazy things. And that's the backdrop of Christianity, particularly for us Americans, right? It's the and I'm going to say this unironically, it's the unofficial state religion. I'm not joking when I say that, and I don't mean
Mhm.
that to be mean or hurtful. I don't think it should be the official state religion. That's a political point, but like, just
Well, I mean, even though Biden's described, like, oh, he's a devout Catholic. It's like, well, who cares?
Yeah.
Like, why
Well,
does that matter?
yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously it matters to a lot of evangelicals with the Trump
I
Pence
guess.
thing.
But I mean, that goes back to, like you mentioned, like, it's the unofficial state
Yeah,
religion, like,
exactly.
because it
Like it
still
matters
assumes,
to
like,
us.
that has to be a selling point.
Yeah, it's a credibility thing for politicians, which is really sad. But that's another discussion we could talk about. Biden and his faith, or just anything like that. Anyway, never met a Catholic I didn't like though. Anyway, so that's a true story statement. I've met Biden though, so he's a Catholic, so the odds are in his favor. Is all I'm telling you. Uh, anyway, so I say all that to say, like, I just I'm a little hesitant to like totally buy in, but like the model and the idea, because like my critique I think still carries some weight because I don't feel like you adequately, and this is just my only counterpoint because I'm running on fumes here, so to speak. And I don't know if you address the idea that like culturally when we bring people in, and maybe this is just us being better about our discipleship, we incentivize them to become only a part of our community rather than to join the community. And this community is also part of the broader community. And I think that,
Hmm.
you know what I mean? Like I think, and this is, man, this is getting really heady. That I think that sometimes we get too much into the identity and the idea of a Christian, but like you see it in churches, like I don't know how to describe it, but it's a reality that we experience. Like, the people I'm talking about that like the couple that has like two kids and they hang out with the other couple that has two kids and they only hang out with that couple and the other kids only hang out and they grow up together and they're best friends, and that situation, like that happens. It's a real thing that happens in churches, and they go to the same school, they live in the same town, and their whole life they're just doing this thing, and they got this kind of like, I don't want to say a small worldview, but like, a majority of these kids' lives and these parents' lives revolve around the church, for worse, not for better. You know what I mean? Like they don't have anybody outside of it to engage in this world, and they lack the ability to bring some of that. And this is what I fight for, because I really think that I really have strong convictions on this. That the church has failed to be culturally relevant, to be intellectually viable, to be part of the world in a way that you can actually communicate your message effectively. Ben, one of your original arguments when we were doing this, is not what you argued, but when we talked about it in text, is that you said, and I think this is an illustration. I'm not nailing you down to this, but you said like people are less open to ideas. And I'm like, I don't think people are less open to ideas when it comes to anything. I think people are less open to this particular idea because of how we represented it and what we've done. And because we can't engage in our world when it comes to science, we can't engage when it comes to social issues, we can't engage when it comes to a lot of different things. And we are pretty content and fairly happy. And it's a really big temptation if you're a Christian, and I mean this as a non-pastor, to get into your own bubble. And we do it anyway on our own social media feeds, but I'm talking about it in like real life too, though, to only associate with people that just kind of happen to go to your church. And you're not doing it on purpose. You like the people, you enjoy them, but it's wrong in some sense, because I think it prevents us from fulfilling something that we're asked to do. And so that's why I'm really struggling, because like I just don't feel like there's an easy solution. Like, and like, except for we make the argument like, well, it ought to be, or if you're doing it the right way, then you know what I mean, then this won't happen. But like, I guess then, Ben, like we'll have to get into that nuance, like what is that right way? Do you understand my counterpoint? I mean, I understand it's a long shot,
Yeah, I
it's a Hail
yeah,
Mary.
I hear you. And I think it's no, I think you make a really good point though, because the method that I described, um, I
It's
I
super
do think
great,
it tends to
so sound.
but I do yeah, but I do think it tends to create a lot of laziness and a lot of, sort of apathy towards mission, to just be like, "Oh, well, I'll just live as a Christian and hang out with all these people, and hey, I'm accomplishing the Great Commission. I don't have to put a lot of effort into it and really, put myself out there, so to speak, and actually engage in these things. I can
Yeah.
just sort of, practice my own faith, they can practice theirs, and hey, we're all happy together." I do think it tends to lean that way. But then again, going back to the Old Testament, that seems to be what they wrestled with too. Like that's why God was continually like, "Yeah, I want you to be engaging with like the people around you." I mean, like that does happen. Like even in the book of Jeremiah, where he's like, "Yeah, I'm sending you guys into exile, but like still like go out, get married, settle down, like be a part of those communities." But he does has to consistently warn, like, but don't adopt their gods. Like, don't adopt their faiths either, because like that's not that's gonna counteract like what the actual
Not
mission
what I'm
is.
trying to do.
So there is that warning of like, yeah, like there does have to be those lines that are drawn of like, yeah, we're living together, but like, hey, like there's a line here too. Um And I do think this sort of, and I think a lot of American Christianity has fallen prey to this idea that, I'll own my truths, you own your truths, and hey, we're all good and God's happy with that. I think that's a fallacy too. And I think that's a harmful form of discipleship, because then it's like, okay, well, then what's the point? Right. Like, why not believe something that's maybe a little more convenient for me? Um, if it kind of doesn't matter. It sounded like that was a little bit of your critique of it, which is that if you go too far in the let's just live in community and we're all good, then you don't have room for apologetics and you don't have room for proclamation for people outside of it, where it's like, no, but that should still be practiced too. And I would totally agree with that. And maybe this goes back to your original point
Yeah.
overall, which I think you're accurate, which is the church should be practicing different things. We just need to be much more uh we seem to be better at when to do those things and in what context that is, and we suck at that. So I think,
Oh, that's
which I
good.
think leads to us going
I
like
want
the
to say
extreme route,
yeah.
right? Like either fully revival style, fully discipleship, your truth, my truth thing, and not being able to nuance um, and integrate various forms. I don't know. Am I being fair
Well,
to
humans in
what you're
general
saying?
are bad at nuance.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, you are. I think, and I think you articulate it pretty well. And so, like, I guess that kind of leads us to some extent at an impasse, because I think now we both agree with each other on certain things, which is how
Yeah.
this usually goes. How dinners used to go. All
Maybe not
friends
an
usually.
impasse. I don't know, a meeting of minds, but we still disagree a little bit, maybe. I don't
Yeah,
know,
not too much.
because this became a lot more complicated than I thought it would,
Well, it's good though.
which is fine.
I'm not gonna lie. Like, listeners, I'll tell you right off the bat that we were a little skeptical on this one because, like, it's not really like I don't know. Podcasts are kind of weird. Like, it's discussion oriented, but like we kind of were trying to
Yeah.
go debate. But I'm kind of glad it turned out the way it did. I don't know. I think this feels like a natural stopping point because, like, I don't know that we're gonna reach a hard conclusion. I don't know how you feel,
Yeah, I don't know.
but I think there's
Um,
legitimate takeaways. Like, there's legitimate like critiques and holes, but there's also legitimate strengths that we've highlighted for each
yeah.
side. And I think that I mean, and I think ultimately we'll both. I don't know, Ben. How do you feel about this? Like, I think ultimately we both agree on the sense that we have to be a bit more pragmatic in that
Mhm.
sense. I don't know. Maybe that's the wrong
Yeah.
word, but like willing to like figure out a little bit what works and just trust that. I mean, that was really to your point, to be honest with you. Let God sort out the salvation issue. We just want to be
Mhm.
obedient. Whether it's
Yeah.
belonging
So,
before believing or believing as a proclamation and then be belong.
mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah. So I guess to give something practical for people if they're listening and you're wondering, like, okay, so how do I actually apply this? Because that would be my question as a pastor. Um,
Thanks for the
and
comment.
how I would apply this would be this. It might be a good idea to evaluate your metrics of success when it comes
Ooh,
to
that's
ministry,
true.
especially when it comes to what evangelism and discipleship is. And maybe whenever you plan something, you really need to be deliberate about why are we doing this and be able to question, okay, is that a good reason for doing this though? Because I remember planning for an event where our church was going to be helping out at something, passing out water bottles. And it seemed very clear that for some people, like, well, the purpose of this needs to be to try and get people to come to our church. And I was like, I don't think that's a good reason for doing this. I think we should just
Care about the
do
people.
it to let the community know that, we care about you, not for the purpose of trying to get them to come to the church. And that can be an uphill battle for some people, but that's just an example of, ask those questions. Why do you do things? Be okay also with uh, failing your goals, because and being able to ask, if we have a revival and no one's saved and no one makes a recommitment or whatever, like, is that okay? Right? Like, is it okay if our original goals for this fail? And what does that mean for the future? Does it mean we don't do this again, or does that mean we need to rethink what the purpose of this is? If it comes to having a revival service, I might say just go ahead and scrap it. Um, I'm not gonna lie, I'm very critical of revivals, obviously, but that's just me. But I'm also that's just anyways. So I would say that could be a practical thing.
But just be intentional. That's the thought. because that intentionality, I think that strategy will work for you in some way or another. And even if it's not as ultimately effective as you want it to be, that doesn't mean you can't go back to the drawing board, but stick to it to some extent. Just be thoughtful about how you go about it.